Hey everyone. Get ready to be spooked with bedtime scary stories set on rainy nights. Don't forget to subscribe and like this video. Your support helps me create more of these stories for you to enjoy. Thanks for watching. The day we moved into our new apartment felt like the start of something wonderful. John and I had saved for years to finally buy our first home, and here we were standing in our modest but perfect apartment. Our two kids, Max and Sophie, were racing through the empty rooms, their laughter echoing off the walls as they imagined where their toys and furniture would go. "This is it," John said, slipping his arm around me as we stood in the living room. "Our first home." I smiled, feeling a warm sense of accomplishment. It's everything we wanted. As we unpacked, something caught my eye in the hallway leading to the bedrooms. There, hanging on the wall, was an old, framed photograph of a woman. Her expression was serious, almost stern, and the black and white image had aged poorly, giving it an eerie quality. It felt like her eyes were following me as I moved. "What's this doing here?" I asked, pointing to the photograph. John came over and frowned. "I don't know, must have been left by the previous owner." Below the photo, in faded, handwritten letters, was a caption: "Do not remove." "That's strange," I murmured, a chill creeping up my spine. John shrugged. "Probably just some old superstition. We can take it down later." But I hesitated. Something about the woman's gaze unnerved me, and despite my better judgment, I decided to leave the photo where it was, at least for now. That night, after we finally settled in, exhaustion overcame us all. The kids were fast asleep in their new rooms, and John and I lay in bed, talking about the future, dreaming of all the things we'd do in our new home. But as the clock ticked past midnight, I woke up suddenly, my heart pounding for no apparent reason. The room was dark, the only sound the steady rhythm of John's breathing beside me. I glanced at the alarm clock, 2:13 a.m. An uneasy feeling washed over me, making it impossible to fall back asleep. Quietly, I got out of bed, not wanting to wake John. I decided to check on the kids, a mother's instinct kicking in. As I walked down the hallway, the photograph caught my eye again. I swear I saw movement in the corner of my eye, but when I turned to look at the photo, nothing had changed. The woman's stern face stared back at me, unblinking. Trying to shake off the unease, I continued to Sophie's room. She was sleeping peacefully, clutching her favorite stuffed bear. Max was sprawled out across his bed, snoring lightly. Satisfied that they were safe, I started back toward our room. But as I passed the photograph again, a cold sensation washed over me. I could have sworn the woman's eyes were now looking directly at me. I froze, staring back at the photo, my breath caught in my throat. The woman's eyes seemed darker, more intense. "Stop it," I whispered to myself, forcing my feet to move. "It's just a picture." But as I hurried back to bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. The days that followed should have been filled with the joy of settling into our new home. But instead, a sense of unease settled over us. Little things began to happen. Lights flickering, cold drafts appearing out of nowhere. Objects going missing only to reappear in odd places. Max and Sophie started to complain of strange occurrences. Max insisted that he heard whispering in the hallway at night, even though everyone else was asleep. Sophie claimed that her toys would move on their own, arranging themselves in neat rows when she wasn't looking. John tried to dismiss it all as the kids' overactive imaginations, but I wasn't so sure. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. One night, as I was brushing my teeth, I glanced up at the bathroom mirror and nearly dropped my toothbrush. For a split second, I saw the reflection of the woman from the photograph standing behind me, her eyes wide and filled with an unnatural malice. I spun around, but there was no one there. My heart raced as I backed out of the bathroom, my eyes scanning the empty room. I hurried down the hallway to where the photograph hung, and for the first time, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The woman in the photo was smiling. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the floor, every rustle of the wind outside sent my nerves into overdrive. I couldn't stop thinking about the photograph and the sinister smile that had appeared on the woman's face. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling when I heard it. A soft, rhythmic tapping, like someone knocking on a door. I sat up, straining to hear. The sound was coming from the hallway. Careful not to wake John, I slipped out of bed and tiptoed toward the noise. As I reached the hallway, the tapping stopped abruptly. The apartment was eerily silent, except for the sound of my own breathing. My eyes were drawn to the photograph. The woman's smile was gone, replaced by that same stern, emotionless expression. But something was different. Her hands, once folded neatly in her lap, were now pressed against the glass, as if she were trying to reach out of the photo. My breath caught in my throat. I backed away, but a loud crash from the kitchen made me jump. I rushed toward the noise, my heart pounding, only to find the kitchen in disarray. Cabinets were flung open, dishes shattered on the floor, and the refrigerator door was ajar, its contents strewn across the room. Before I could react, I heard a faint, ghostly whisper, barely audible over my pounding heart. "Do not remove." A chill ran down my spine. I knew, deep down, that the voice belonged to the woman in the photograph. The days that followed were filled with fear and confusion. John, though skeptical at first, began to witness the strange occurrences himself. Doors would slam shut on their own, furniture would shift position, and we would hear footsteps in the hall when no one was there. The kids were terrified. Max refused to sleep alone, and Sophie cried every night, begging us to make the scary lady go away. John and I were at our wits' end, unsure of how to protect our family from something we couldn't even understand. One night, after putting the kids to bed, John decided he'd had enough. He grabbed a hammer and marched toward the hallway. "John, what are you doing?" I called after him, fear gripping my heart. "I'm getting rid of that damn picture," he said through gritted teeth. "It's causing all of this. I know it is." I wanted to stop him, but I was too frightened to argue. I watched as John yanked the photograph off the wall and smashed the glass with the hammer. The moment the glass shattered, the temperature in the apartment plummeted. The lights flickered violently, and a loud, high-pitched scream echoed through the halls. "John, stop!" I screamed. But it was too late. The photograph's frame splintered in his hands, and the photo itself began to burn from the edges inward, the flames unnaturally bright and cold. John dropped it, watching in horror as the fire consumed the image until nothing was left but ashes. For a moment, everything was silent. Then, all at once, the apartment was plunged into darkness. The power outage only lasted a few seconds, but in that brief moment, everything changed. When the lights flickered back on, the apartment felt different, heavier, as if a dark presence had taken hold of it. I was the first to notice. As I stood in the hallway, I caught a glimpse of something in the corner of my eye. Movement, swift and shadowy. I turned my head, but there was nothing there. Yet, the feeling of being watched was stronger than ever. Suddenly, a loud thud echoed from the children's rooms. John and I raced down the hall, fear gripping our hearts. We burst into Sophie's room first, only to find her bed empty. "Sophie!" I screamed, panic rising. John ran to Max's room, where we found both children huddled together under the bed, trembling with fear. "She's here, Mommy!" Sophie cried. "The lady from the picture. She's here!" My blood ran cold. I turned toward the mirror in Sophie's room and gasped. There, in the reflection, was the woman from the photograph. Only now, she wasn't confined to the frame. She stood behind me, her face twisted in a malicious grin, her eyes glowing with a sinister light. Before I could react, the woman's reflection stepped out of the mirror, her ghostly form becoming solid as she moved toward us. The room grew colder with each step she took, the air thick with an overwhelming sense of dread. John grabbed the children and pushed them behind him, but the ghostly woman paid him no mind. Her gaze was fixed on me, her smile widening as she reached out with one hand. "You should have listened," the woman hissed, her voice echoing with a malevolent power. "You should not have removed me." I couldn't move, paralyzed by the woman's presence. Her hand touched my cheek and I felt a cold so intense it burned. I screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the darkness that enveloped the room. I could barely make out John as he tried to pull me away, but an unseen force flung him across the room, slamming him into the wall with a sickening crunch. The children's screams filled the air, but their voices were drowned out by the woman's laughter, a cold, cruel sound that filled the entire apartment. When I regained consciousness, the apartment was eerily quiet. My head throbbed, and my vision was blurred. I struggled to my feet, my heart pounding as I realized the room was empty. John and the children were gone. "John? Max? Sophie?" I called out, my voice hoarse, but there was no answer. I stumbled through the apartment, panic rising with each step. The photograph was gone as if it had never existed, but the sense of dread remained. I checked the children's rooms, but they were empty. Their beds were neatly made as if they had never been slept in. I ran to the living room, the kitchen, the bathroom, every room in the apartment, but there was no sign of my family. It was as if they had vanished into thin air. As I stood in the living room, my mind racing, I caught a glimpse of something in the corner of my eye, a reflection in the window. I turned slowly, my breath catching in my throat. There, in the glass, I saw them. John, Max, and Sophie, standing together, their faces pale and expressionless, their eyes hollow and empty. And standing behind them, her hands resting on John's shoulders, was the woman from the photograph, her twisted smile as wide and cruel as ever. I screamed, the sound echoing through the empty apartment, but there was no one left to hear it. The next day, the landlord found the apartment empty, our belongings untouched. There was no sign of us, no explanation for our disappearance. But in the hallway, where the photograph once hung, a new picture had appeared. A photograph of our family, standing together, our faces frozen in terror, and beneath it, a new caption had been added, "Do not remove." And the woman from the original photograph, she was gone, her place in the cursed frame now taken by us, waiting for the next family to move in. Because the apartment had a new owner now, the woman had passed on her curse, and the cycle would continue. We were now part of the story, our souls trapped within the walls, just as hers had been. And so, the apartment remained, waiting for its next unsuspecting tenants, who would find the photograph hanging on the wall, who would ignore the warning, who would learn the hard way that some things should never be disturbed. Get ready for the next story that will send chills down your spine. I always trusted my instincts. They'd never led me wrong before. But lately, something felt off. Subtle changes in Mark, my husband. Little things that didn't quite add up. The way he moved, the way he spoke, even the way he looked at me sometimes. It was like he was trying to remember something or imitate a feeling he didn't fully understand. It started small. Mark, who'd always hated coffee, suddenly began drinking it every morning, black and bitter. He said he'd developed a taste for it, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something deeper had changed. Then, there were the nights when he'd disappear for hours, coming home with a strange, satisfied smile and bloodshot eyes. When I'd ask where he'd been, he'd just laugh and say he'd gone for a walk. I wanted to believe him. I really did. We'd been through so much together, built a life, shared dreams. But some nights I'd wake up to find him standing by the window, staring into the dark, his breath fogging up the glass. He never heard me when I called his name, lost in some deep, silent reverie. And when he finally turned to look at me, there was a darkness in his eyes that sent a shiver down my spine. But I loved him. I told myself that people change, that maybe I was just being paranoid. I ignored the small voice in the back of my mind that whispered something was terribly wrong. One night, when Mark was out again, I did something I'd never done before. I searched through his things. I wasn't sure what I was looking for, but I felt compelled, as if something was guiding me. I found nothing unusual in his drawers or the closet. But when I checked the basement, my heart froze. There, in a corner, hidden beneath some old blankets, were clothes, torn and covered in what looked like dried blood. My hands trembled as I touched them, my mind racing with fear and confusion. I recognized these clothes. They were Mark's favorite shirt and jeans. But why were they hidden here, stained like this? I stood frozen in the basement, clutching the bloodied clothes when I heard the front door creak open upstairs. Mark was back. Panic gripped me, and I quickly hid the clothes again, my heart pounding in my chest. I ran up the stairs, trying to act normal, but my hands wouldn't stop shaking. Mark was in the kitchen, his back turned to me, humming softly as he prepared something on the counter. He didn't seem to notice me at first, but when he finally turned around, there was something different about his smile, something cold, something sinister. "I was just making us a late-night snack," he said, his voice smooth and calm, but there was an edge to it that made my skin crawl. I forced myself to smile back, but inside I was screaming. Over the next few days I became increasingly paranoid. I watched Mark closely, noting every little thing he did. His movements seemed too fluid, too deliberate. like he was performing a role he had rehearsed 1,000 times. I couldn't shake the feeling that the man I was living with wasn't really my husband. And then the news came. A series of brutal murders had taken place in our town, bodies found mutilated beyond recognition. The police were baffled, and the town was gripped by fear. My unease grew into full-blown terror. I couldn't stop thinking about the blood-stained clothes in the basement, the strange behavior of the man I thought I knew so well. One evening, after Mark had gone out again, I decided to confront my fears. I went back to the basement, my hands shaking as I uncovered the clothes. This time, I noticed something I hadn't seen before, a piece of paper tucked into the pocket of the jeans. I unfolded it, my breath catching in my throat. It was a list of names, people from our town, all of them now dead. And at the bottom of the list, in Mark's handwriting, was my name. My heart raced as the truth hit me like a tidal wave. The man upstairs wasn't my husband. He was something else, something monstrous. Suddenly, I heard the basement door creak open. I looked up and saw Mark standing there, his eyes gleaming in the dim light. But they weren't Mark's eyes anymore. They were black, empty voids, devoid of any humanity. "Jennifer," he said softly, his voice dripping with malice. "I've been waiting for this moment." I tried to run, but he was too fast. He was on me in an instant, his hands gripping my shoulders with unnatural strength. His face twisted into something grotesque, something not human. I screamed, but there was no one to hear me. As the creature that had taken my husband's place revealed its true form, I realized the horrifying truth. I had been living with this monster for months, oblivious to its nature. It had taken everything from me, and now it was going to take my life. The last thing I saw before the darkness consumed me was the creature's mouth curling into a wicked grin, its teeth sharp and gleaming in the dim light. And then there was only pain, and the sound of the rain outside, echoing through the empty house. No one ever found out what happened to me. I became just another name on a list, another unsolved mystery in a string of brutal killings. And as for Mark, or whatever had been pretending to be Mark, it vanished without a trace, leaving behind nothing but fear and unanswered questions. But somewhere, in the dark corners of the world, the creature still lurks, waiting for its next victim, ready to take on a new face, a new life. And no one will ever know the difference until it's too late. It's time for the third story of the night. It was supposed to be a simple escape. Emily and Jake, both exhausted from the grind of city life, decided a weekend camping trip was just what they needed. A few days disconnected from the world, surrounded by nature, and rekindling their bond seemed perfect. Jake had found a remote spot in the woods, far from any town, where they could have total peace. The drive was long, the roads winding deeper into the forest until even the GPS gave up. But Emily didn't mind. The dense trees, the thick underbrush, and the faint sound of birds provided a serene backdrop. They set up their tent in a clearing surrounded by towering pines. It was beautiful, almost too perfect. As the sun dipped below the horizon, they sat by the fire, laughing and reminiscing about better times. The crackling of the flames, the gentle rustle of leaves, and the distant call of an owl made them feel miles away from their problems. But as night fell, the forest seemed to change. The trees loomed larger, their branches twisting into unnatural shapes. The wind, once a gentle breeze, now howled through the trees like a warning. Emily shivered, pulling her jacket tighter around her. "Jake, do you hear that?" Jake paused, listening. "It's just the wind, babe. Don't worry." But Emily couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. It started as a light drizzle, barely noticeable at first. But within minutes, the sky opened up and the rain came pouring down. The fire hissed and sputtered before going out entirely, plunging them into darkness. "Damn it," Jake muttered, fumbling for the flashlight. "We need to get inside the tent before we get soaked." They scrambled into the tent, their clothes already drenched. The rain pounded on the fabric, and the wind rattled the poles. It was as if the forest had come alive, angry and unforgiving. Emily lay next to Jake, her heart racing. The sound of the rain was deafening, but it was the silence between the gusts of wind that terrified her. She clutched Jake's hand, trying to find comfort in his presence, but deep down she knew something was wrong. Then, over the roar of the storm, she heard it, a low, guttural growl. She sat up, her eyes wide. "Jake, did you hear that?" Jake turned to her, his face pale. "Yeah, I did." The growl came again, louder this time, followed by the sound of branches snapping and leaves crunching. Something, or someone, was moving outside the tent. Jake grabbed the flashlight and unzipped the tent, shining the beam into the darkness. The rain made it difficult to see, but he caught a glimpse of movement, a tall, shadowy figure standing just beyond the clearing. "Who's there?" Jake called out, his voice trembling. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it stepped closer, revealing more of itself in the light. Emily gasped. The figure was enormous, easily over 7 feet tall, with long limbs and a hunched posture. Its skin was pale, almost gray, and its eyes glowed with a menacing yellow light. Before Jake could react, another figure appeared, then another. They surrounded the tent, their faces twisted in a grotesque mix of hunger and anger. "They're human," Jake whispered, though he didn't believe it himself. These things looked more like beasts than men. One of the figures lunged forward, tearing through the tent fabric with sharp, claw-like nails. Emily screamed as the creature grabbed Jake, pulling him out into the rain. "Emily, run!" Jake shouted, struggling against the creature's grip. But Emily couldn't move. Fear paralyzed her as she watched Jake being dragged into the darkness. The creature's snarls and grunts echoed through the forest, drowning out Jake's cries. Finally, her survival instincts kicked in. She scrambled out of the torn tent, running blindly through the forest, the rain stinging her skin. The trees blurred past her as she stumbled over roots and rocks, her breath coming in ragged gasps. But no matter how fast she ran, she could hear them behind her, chasing, closing in. Emily didn't know how long she had been running when she finally collapsed against a tree, her lungs burning, her legs giving out beneath her. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, but the air was thick with mist, obscuring everything around her. For a moment, there was silence. She dared to hope that she had lost them. Then, out of the mist, a hand shot out, grabbing her by the throat and slamming her against the tree. Emily choked. her hands clawing at the fingers wrapped around her neck. She looked up into the eyes of one of the creatures, and for the first time she saw it clearly. It was a man, or had been once. His face was gaunt, the skin stretched tight over his bones, and his mouth was filled with sharp, broken teeth. His eyes, once human, were now wild and animalistic. There was no humanity left in him, only a primal, savage hunger. He leaned in close, sniffing her hair like a predator sizing up its prey. "You shouldn't have come here," he growled, his voice low and guttural. Emily tried to speak, to beg for her life, but the words wouldn't come. She could feel herself slipping into unconsciousness, the edges of her vision going dark. But then, just as suddenly as he had grabbed her, the creature let go. Emily collapsed to the ground, gasping for air. She looked up to see the other creatures had arrived, their eyes fixed on her with a terrifying intensity. "She's not the one we want," one of them snarled. "Where's the other?" "Let her go," another one hissed. "She's useless to us." Emily didn't wait to hear more. She forced herself to her feet and ran again, tears streaming down her face. But the forest seemed endless, and no matter how far she went, she couldn't escape the sounds of pursuit. Emily didn't know how she found her way back to the clearing where their camp had been, but when she arrived, she wished she hadn't. Jake was there, but he was no longer fighting. He lay on the ground, barely conscious, surrounded by the creatures. They had built a fire, and the flames cast eerie shadows on their faces, making them look even more monstrous. One of the creatures, the leader, held a long, curved knife. He began chanting in a language Emily didn't understand, and the others joined in, their voices rising in a chilling harmony. Emily watched in horror as the leader raised the knife high above his head, preparing to plunge it into Jake's chest. "No!" she screamed, rushing forward. But she was too late. The knife came down, and Jake's scream was cut short as the blade pierced his heart. The chanting grew louder, more frenzied, and Emily could feel the air around her grow heavy with a malevolent energy. The creatures began to change, their bodies shifting and contorting in ways that defied nature. They were becoming something else, something far more terrifying. Emily fell to her knees, tears streaming down her face. She had failed. She couldn't save Jake, and now she was going to die too. But the creatures didn't turn on her. Instead, they began to retreat into the shadows, their grotesque forms fading into the darkness. The leader was the last to leave. He paused, looking down at Emily with a twisted smile. "The woods never forget," he whispered, "and neither will you." Then he was gone, leaving Emily alone in the clearing with Jake's lifeless body. Emily sat in the clearing for hours, unable to move, unable to think. The rain had stopped, and the forest was silent once more. But the silence was worse than the noise. It was oppressive, suffocating. Eventually, she forced herself to stand. She had to leave. She couldn't stay here, not with Jake's body lying in the dirt, a grim reminder of what had happened. But as she turned to leave, something caught her eye. A mark on the ground, just beside Jake's body. It was a symbol, carved into the earth with precision. A circle with strange, intricate patterns inside it. She didn't know what it meant, but she knew it wasn't good. It was a mark, a sign of something far more sinister at work in these woods. Emily stumbled back to the road, barely able to stay on her feet. She didn't look back. She couldn't. But as she walked, she could feel the weight of those eyes on her, watching her every step, waiting for the right moment to strike again. Emily never spoke of what happened in the woods. When the authorities found her, she was incoherent, babbling about monsters and rituals. They assumed she had gone mad, traumatized by the loss of her fiancé. But Emily knew the truth. She knew that the woods were alive, that the creatures that lived there were waiting, watching, biding their time. She knew that she had been marked, that the symbol she had seen in the clearing was a curse, one that would follow her for the rest of her life. She moved to a new city, far away from the forest, but she could never escape the feeling that she was being watched. Every shadow, every rustle of leaves, every creak of a floorboard at night. It all reminded her of that night, of the creatures that had taken Jake from her. And she was right to be afraid. Because the woods never forget, and neither do the things that dwell within them. One night, as she lay in bed, she heard it again, a low, guttural growl, just outside her window. Emily's heart stopped. She knew what it meant. They had found her. She got up slowly, her hands shaking as she reached for the doorknob. There was no point in running. She knew that now. They would always find her. As she opened the door, she saw them, tall, shadowy figures standing at the edge of her vision, their eyes glowing with that same menacing yellow light. The leader stepped forward, his twisted smile as terrifying as ever. "The woods never forget," he whispered again, and this time Emily knew it was true. Because in the end, there is no escape. The woods are always watching, always waiting, and they will come for you, no matter where you hide. The last thing Emily heard was the sound of footsteps, heavy and deliberate, as the creatures moved closer. The last thing she saw was the leader's eyes, glowing in the darkness. And then there was nothing but the night, and the sound of the woods, whispering their eternal curse. Now, let's dive into the fourth creepy story. Are you ready to be scared? Falling in love with Lilith was like stepping into a dream. She was everything I never thought I deserved. Sharp-witted, beautiful in a way that felt almost otherworldly, and with an air of mystery that pulled me in deeper every day. Our time together in college was intoxicating, and I found myself helplessly drawn to her like a moth to a flame. It all seemed perfect until the night she invited me to her place. The invitation came casually, as if she had done it 1,000 times before. But the way her eyes lingered on mine, the faint smile that played at the corners of her lips, it felt like a silent challenge, one I was too blinded by infatuation to refuse. I arrived at her home just after sunset, the sky bleeding out the last light of day. Her house was nestled at the edge of the woods, its exterior seemingly untouched by time, an old, almost Gothic structure that stood in stark contrast to the modern world I knew. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with the scent of incense, and dim candlelight cast flickering shadows on the walls. She greeted me with that enigmatic smile, her eyes glinting in the low light. "I'm glad you came, Jacob," she said, her voice as smooth and alluring as ever. She led me to the living room, where a fire crackled warmly in the hearth. A glass of wine was already waiting for me on the table, and though I noticed she wasn't drinking herself, I didn't think much of it. I took a sip, and we began to talk, the conversation flowing as easily as it always did. But then, slowly, I started to feel strange. The room seemed to tilt, the fire's light stretching and warping before my eyes. My limbs grew heavy, my head swimming in a fog I couldn't shake. Panic fluttered in my chest, but before I could make sense of what was happening, everything went dark. When I woke, I was no longer in her living room. Cold stone pressed against my back, and the scent of damp earth filled my nostrils. I blinked rapidly, trying to clear my vision, only to realize I was lying in the center of a dark, circular room. The walls were lined with strange symbols, etched deep into the stone, and the only light came from candles that seemed to flicker with an unnatural intensity. I tried to move, but my arms and legs were bound, held fast by thick ropes that dug painfully into my skin. Panic surged through me as I struggled against my restraints, my breath coming in short, desperate gasps. That's when I saw her. Lilith stood at the edge of the circle, her eyes devoid of the warmth I once thought I saw in them. Her expression was cold, almost clinical, as she watched me struggle. But there was something else in her gaze, something dark and hungry. "You should have stayed away," she murmured, almost to herself. "But men like you are so easy to manipulate, always thinking with your heart instead of your head." "Lilith, please," I begged, my voice hoarse with fear. "What's going on? Let me go." She didn't respond. Instead, she began to chant, her voice low and melodic, speaking words that sent a chill down my spine. As she spoke, the symbols on the walls began to glow, casting the room in an eerie, pulsating light. I screamed for help, but the walls seemed to absorb the sound, leaving me alone with the echo of my own terror. The light from the symbols grew brighter, more intense, until it felt like the very air was vibrating with energy. And then I saw it, something moving in the shadows, just beyond the circle of light. My heart pounded in my chest as the shape drew closer, revealing itself inch by inch. It was a creature, unlike anything I had ever seen. Its body was a twisted mass of sinew and bone, its skin slick and black like oil. Its face, or what should have been a face, was a grotesque mockery of human features, eyes too wide, mouth too large, filled with jagged, dripping teeth. The creature let out a low, guttural growl, and the sound reverberated through the room, shaking the very ground beneath me. My blood ran cold as it stepped closer, its eyes locked on mine with a malevolent intelligence that spoke of unimaginable cruelty. "Lilith, please!" I cried again, tears streaming down my face. "Please, don't do this!" But she simply watched, her expression unchanging, as the creature reached out a hand, or a claw, I couldn't tell, to touch the edge of the circle. The light flared in response, and I felt a jolt of pain shoot through my body, as if the very air around me was trying to tear me apart. The creature roared, a sound so loud and filled with rage that it seemed to pierce my soul. And then, to my horror, it stepped into the circle, the light shattering like glass as it crossed the boundary. I screamed, thrashing against the ropes with all my might, but it was no use. The creature loomed over me, its eyes burning with a hunger that made my stomach churn. It reached down, its clawed hand wrapping around my throat, and I felt my breath being squeezed from my lungs. This was it. This was how I would die. But then, as the darkness closed in, I saw something in Lilith's eyes. A flicker of doubt, of hesitation. It was brief, almost imperceptible, but it was enough to make the creature pause, its grip loosening ever so slightly. "Lilith," I gasped, my voice barely a whisper. "You don't have to do this." For a moment, just a moment, I thought I saw her resolve waver. But then, just as quickly, it hardened again, and she turned away, leaving me alone with the monster. I felt a rush of cold air as the creature let out another roar, and then everything went black. When I woke again, I was back in my own bed, the early morning light filtering through the curtains. My heart was pounding, my body drenched in sweat, but when I looked around, everything seemed normal. Had it all been a nightmare? A vivid, terrifying dream? But as I sat up, wincing at the pain in my limbs, I noticed something on my bedside table. A small, black stone, etched with the same symbols I had seen on the walls of that dark room. I reached out to touch it, and the moment my fingers made contact, a jolt of energy shot through me sprawling back onto the bed. And that's when I knew. It hadn't been a dream. It was real. And whatever Lilith had done, whatever that creature was, it wasn't over. The next night, as I lay in bed, too afraid to sleep, I heard it, the low, guttural growl of the creature echoing through the darkness. It was coming for me. And this time, there would be no escape. We've made it to the last story of the night. This final tale is the scariest one yet, guaranteed to give you chills. I was always chasing the next big story, the one that would get me noticed. So when my editor asked me to investigate rumors of malpractice at St. Mary's Hospital, I jumped at the chance. The hospital had been in the news recently. Patients dying under mysterious circumstances, doctors accused of negligence, and whispers of something darker happening behind closed doors. I spent the day interviewing families, staff, and even patients who had lost loved ones. They all told similar stories. Doctors who were absent during critical moments, nurses who ignored cries for help, and a sense of despair that permeated the hospital. But there was one place no one wanted to talk about. The basement. They called it the Silent Wing, a part of the hospital that had been closed off for years. Rumor had it that it was where the worst of the negligence happened, where patients went in and never came out. I knew I had to see it for myself. That night, I returned to St. Mary's. The hospital was eerily quiet, the fluorescent lights flickering in the empty hallways. I made my way to the basement, my heart pounding in my chest. The door to the Silent Wing was rusty and half-hinged, as if it hadn't been opened in years. I hesitated for a moment, but then I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The air was thick with dust and the smell of decay. The walls were lined with old, yellowed medical charts, and broken equipment lay scattered across the floor. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing empty hospital beds and overturned gurneys. I moved deeper into the basement, the silence pressing in around me. But then I heard it, a faint sound, like whispering coming from the far end of the hallway. I followed the sound, my hands shaking as I gripped my flashlight. The whispering grew louder as I approached a door at the end of the hall. It was slightly ajar, and I could see a dim light coming from inside. I pushed the door open and what I saw made my blood run cold. The room was filled with old patient files, scattered haphazardly on the floor. But that wasn't what terrified me. In the center of the room stood a figure, its back turned to me. It was tall and gaunt, its body covered in what looked like tattered hospital robes. I tried to back away, but my feet felt glued to the floor. The figure began to turn slowly, and when it finally faced me, I stifled a scream. Its face was a grotesque mask of decay, skin peeling away to reveal raw flesh beneath. Its eyes were hollow, empty sockets, and yet I could feel its gaze burning into me. The whispering grew louder, filling my ears with a cacophony of voices, all speaking at once, all accusing, all angry. I turned to run, but the door slammed shut behind me, trapping me inside with the creature. It moved toward me, its movements jerky and unnatural, like a puppet on strings. My flashlight flickered and died, plunging the room into darkness. But I could still hear it, the sound of its raspy breathing growing closer, the smell of death overwhelming me. I backed into a corner, desperate to escape, but there was nowhere to go. The whispers reached a crescendo, and then I felt it. Cold, clammy hands grabbing me, pulling me down to the floor. I struggled, kicking and screaming, but the hands were too strong. I could feel them dragging me into the darkness, into the void. When I woke up, I was lying on a hospital bed, my body stiff and sore. The room was bright, sterile, the complete opposite of the basement. I looked around, confused, disoriented. A doctor stood at the foot of my bed, his expression unreadable. "You're lucky to be alive," he said, his voice calm, almost mechanical. "What happened?" I asked, my voice hoarse. The doctor didn't answer. Instead, he handed me a folder, the same one I had seen in the basement. I opened it, my hands trembling. Inside were photos of me. The first one was from the day I had arrived at the hospital, but the others, they were different. In each photo, I was lying in a hospital bed, tubes and wires connected to my body. The final photo was of me, lying motionless, my eyes closed, as if I were dead. I looked up at the doctor, fear gripping my heart. "What is this?" He smiled, a cold, sinister smile. "You were one of our patients, Mr. Harris. You've been here for a long time." "No," I whispered, shaking my head. "That's impossible. I'm a journalist. I came here to investigate." The doctor's smile widened. "You've been a patient here for years, Mr. Harris. The doctors, they weren't neglecting their duties. They were trying to save you." My mind raced, memories flooding back, flashes of pain, of doctors standing over me, of machines beeping. But those memories were fragmented, disjointed. The doctor leaned in close, his breath cold against my skin. "But you never survived, Mr. Harris. You died on that operating table years ago." I felt the blood drain from my face as the truth settled in. I hadn't come to investigate the hospital. I had come to die. The doctor's eyes glinted with malice as he stepped back, and the room around me began to change. The walls darkened, the sterile light flickering, and I was back in the basement, back in the silent wing. The figure stood before me again, its hollow eyes staring into mine, and then, In a voice that sent chills down my spine, it spoke. "Welcome home, Mr. Harris. You'll be staying with us forever." I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The darkness closed in around me, the cold hands grabbing me once more, pulling me into the void. And this time, I knew there was no escape. St. Mary's Hospital had claimed another soul, and I was doomed to walk its haunted halls, just another lost spirit trapped in the silent wing, waiting for the next unfortunate visitor to join me.